Many thanks, Dean Rizal, for this wonderful invitation. My deep gratitude to George Mason University for hosting, and Sumit Srivastav, President of the Alumni Association, for connecting us. And thanks so much to each of you, dear students and friends, for making the time to be here. So join me on a journey around the world, a journey to renew democracy. In Kaduna, Nigeria, an audit in 2015 revealed that a health clinic promised to the citizens, paid by the budget, only existed on paper, a ghost clinic. That same year, Ukrainian media reported scandalous tales of extravagantly inflated prices for government contracts awarded to powerful oligarchs, siphoning funds from citizens. $4 million for constructing a little strip of road. The indigenous community in Costa Rica suffered for decades from violent conflict and lack of basic education and health, excluded by successive governments. From corruption to poor service delivery to exclusion of the marginalized, these are unfortunately familiar tales of citizens globally suffering the impact of poor governance without voice or remedy. They live in democracies, but the ballot box alone has not proven sufficient for delivering on people's aspirations. But what if a mother in Kaduna could actually monitor the construction of those health clinics and give feedback through her mobile phone to government leaders who took corrective actions? What if in Ukraine, young reformers joined hands to take on those powerful oligarchs and openly disclose opaque public procurement contracts that citizens monitor, and the government saved $1 billion? What if in Costa Rica, government reformers and the indigenous community join hands to set up a consultation mechanism that built trust, abated conflict, and ushered vital investments in health and education? All of this happened. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. These resulted from collaborative actions between government reformers and citizen groups under the Open Government Partnership, or OGP, an organization that seeks to renew democracy for and with citizens. OGP was launched at the United Nations in 2011. In just 10 years, 78 countries and 76 local governments, together representing more than 2 billion people, have joined the partnership along with thousands of civil society organizations. But you know, over the same period, the global context worsened significantly. So today when we meet, we confront an unprecedented confluence of 5 crises. First, a crisis of democracy, reflecting rising authoritarianism and plummeting citizen trust in government. Second, a pandemic health crisis. Third, an accompanying global economic crisis. Fourth, a crisis of inequality, of income, race, and gender laid bare. And fifth, a climate crisis, ravaging communities with fires, flood, and droughts. At this critical moment in history, our imperative, as we also mark OGP's 10th anniversary this year, is to leverage this global platform to renew democracy and help tackle these crises. The goal of OGP, in the words of one of its founders, former US President Obama, is to ensure that governments truly serve its citizens rather than itself. To accomplish this, OGP empowers government and civil society to together co-create concrete reforms in OGP action plans. Reforms that make governments more transparent, participatory, inclusive, and accountable, while engaging citizens and civil society to shape and oversee government. You see, in this way, OGP represents a unique partnership between open governments and engaged citizenry working together to deliver better results for citizens. Over the last decade, government and civil society have together co-created more than 4,500 reforms across the partnership. For example, when Nigerian President Buhari announced that Nigeria would join OGP, an alliance of 200 civil society organizations immediately presented to the government a draft action plan with their ambitious reforms, with their ambitious asks. Over the last 4 years, this alliance and an interministerial group led by the Finance Ministry have co-created 2 ambitious action plans. In OGP, there is accountability for these action plans from civil society, but also from an independent reporting mechanism, or IRM, which publicly assesses, did the government actually open up? Evidence from the IRM shows that when government co-creates with civil society, the action plan is more ambitious and the results are stronger. Of the 2,000 OGP reforms reviewed by the IRM, over 20% have been assessed to have made governments significantly more open. In sum, over its first decade, OGP has grown into a global platform with a well-functioning mechanism at scale. But over this same period, the global context, the broader global context, worsened significantly. So today, democracy itself is under threat in many parts of the world. The last 15 years have seen the unfettered rise of elected, authoritarian, and populist leaders. From Hungary to Russia to Turkey, Tanzania, and beyond, including in OGP countries, elected leaders are attacking civil society, media, oversight institutions, spreading disinformation. Today, even though citizens in a majority of countries are electing their governments through formal electoral processes, citizen trust in their government has plummeted. In far too many countries, citizens perceive their governments to be disconnected and unresponsive to their needs, or corrupt and captured by special interests. Unfortunately, we see the same crisis of democracy mirrored in several OGP countries. But at the same time, we are also seeing courageous OGP reformers elsewhere advance innovative reforms that show a hopeful way forward, that light pathways towards a better democracy. These reforms make governments more open and engage citizens and civil society in areas where they have an interest and capacity to engage, empowering them to shape and oversee public services, public policies, institutions every day, not just once every few years when we cast our vote. In this way, these reforms renew democracy beyond the ballot box to deliver better results for citizens. Open government, then, is not just about making governments more transparent, but fundamentally about governments working collaboratively with citizens and civil society to tackle shared challenges. Even though no single government has all the constituent elements, across OGP, 4 clusters of reforms are transforming the relationship between citizens and their governments. Our goal is to scale this up scale up these 4 clusters of reforms to build more vibrant, healthier democracies. The first cluster of reforms is opening up opaque institutions to build citizen trust and fight corruption. You know, globally, governments spend a staggering $13 trillion through public procurement contracts. But guess what? Only 3% are published openly. By contrast, those young reformers in Ukraine disclosed previously opaque contracts as open data on an online Prozoro platform, and citizens then reported 14,000 violations on a Dozoro platform, saving government $1 billion, and 82% of the private sector surveyed reporting reduced corruption. Galvanized by such results, 70 OGP governments have committed to open contracts. You've read the Panama Papers, then the Paradise Papers, now the Pandora Papers. These show illicit and stolen wealth stashed in anonymous companies. Today, 30 OGP countries, including Armenia, Slovakia, and UK, are opening up who really owns these companies, allowing journalists and activists to follow the money and ensure, for instance, that those massive COVID-19 bailouts are not captured by the politically connected. Through South Africa's Vulekamali platform, reformers are making budgets, including COVID-19 spending, more accessible to citizens, so citizens can follow the money. One parent, upset by his local school's infrastructure, was able to use this platform to track the funding that was meant to fix his schools and hold the government accountable. Today, his children and those of others are learning in safer places. The second cluster of reforms is to engage citizens to shape policies and services that impact, that touch their daily lives. This is, of course, particularly impactful at the local level, where governments are closest to their citizens, and citizens care deeply about their schools, their streets, their health clinics. So you remember Kaduna, Nigeria, when the budget director discovered that ghost clinic, he partnered with citizens to become the government's eyes and ears, uploading photos and feedback, which resulted in a record completion of 250 health clinics in 2 years. In Italy, when an investigative journalist reported that only 9% of EU funds was being utilized, the government disclosed on an open Coesione platform all projects financed by, get this, a whopping 100 billion euros of EU financing. But what was even more fascinating was they then launched a massive public awareness campaign to enlist citizens and, interestingly, high school students to become on-the-ground citizen monitors of projects they cared about. You know, for most of us, government budgets are distant, opaque, and inaccessible. In contrast, in Madrid, Spain, reformers set aside 100 million euros for citizens to themselves propose and fund projects that respond to their needs. Today, 90 governments around the world are emulating the Decide Madrid platform. At a time when populist leaders are polarizing our societies, OGP reformers are convening citizens in citizens' assemblies to deliberate contentious policies, such as same-sex marriage in Ireland or ensuring climate justice in France. And guess what? Citizens are finding that they are able to forge shared solutions across political divides when politicians clearly cannot. The third cluster of reforms is empowering the most marginalized groups in society. In a rapidly growing area in OGP, reformers are enhancing access to justice for historically marginalized communities, such as the Roma minority in North Macedonia or those living below the poverty line in Indonesia, and providing them with legal services so they too may fight for their rights and fight discrimination. Another rapidly growing priority is empowering women politically, socially, economically, such as Jalisco, Mexico, targeting the gender wage gap, or Buenos Aires, Argentina, empowering women with information on sexual and reproductive health services. The fourth cluster is leveraging digital and civic space as key enablers. You see, across OGP, digital technology has been a real accelerator for opening up government and mobilizing direct citizen engagement, as with the Prozoro Dozoro platform or Decide Madrid. But OGP reformers are also now confronting digital threats to democracy, such as the insidious spread of disinformation online, illegal surveillance, and attacks on our individual privacy. Through OGP, the Netherlands and Canada are therefore strengthening transparency of online political campaigns. Finland launched a digital literacy campaign to empower students to spot and challenge disinformation. Canada and France are strengthening the transparency of public algorithms used to deliver services. An absolutely central priority in OGP is to protect civic space, the basic ability of citizens, you and I, to freely speak, associate, and assemble. Without this, democracy doesn't work. Unfortunately, over the past decade, civil liberties have declined in most countries, including majority of OGP countries. Many governments have used the pandemic to expand state surveillance and arbitrarily restrict civil liberties. And yet, these problems remain unaddressed, with only a few exceptions. For instance, in Mexico, following the 2017 illegal surveillance scandal, where the Pegasus spyware was used to target anti-corruption activists, the new government committed to multi-stakeholder supervision of the state's digital surveillance. Instead of restricting civil liberties, OGP countries need to leverage vibrant civic space, as most beautifully exemplified by South Korea. You see, after millions descended on Gwanghwamun Square in candlelight protests to bring down the corrupt regime of President Park, the new government of President Moon invited those protesters and citizens back to the same Gwanghwamun Square, except this time to propose policies that respond to their pain points. We need more Gwanghwamun Squares in our world today. In this way, reformers are advancing these 4 clusters of reforms to renew democracy. This same combination of open government and engaged citizenry is essential not just for tackling the crisis of democracy, but also the other societal crises. And that is because these crises are too big for any government or any group to tackle alone. At its core, open government galvanizes collaborative actions between governments and citizens, citizens who don't just represent passive beneficiaries of governmental action, but are active agents and partners in a shared struggle. So, for instance, to recover from the pandemic and economic crisis, governments mobilized massive $12 trillion for COVID-19 stimulus and safety nets. Millions of lives and livelihoods are at stake. But when so much money moves so fast, corruption scandals are also proliferating. We need open budgets, open contracts, open company ownership so citizens can follow this money. In Colombia, the government disclosed its COVID-19 stimulus as open data, and interestingly then, empowered citizen auditors through a mobile app to monitor and report whether these funds were reaching the intended beneficiaries. We need similar openness and citizen monitoring in the vital area of vaccine contracting and distribution. To tackle the crisis of inequality, we must scale up 3 vital reforms that we have already discussed. First, empower the most marginalized at the bottom, for instance, by enhancing their access to justice. Second, combat corruption and capture at the top, for instance, through open contracting. And third, build social cohesion across polarized societies, for instance, through citizen assemblies. Tackling climate crisis has been a relatively nascent but promising area in OGP. Argentina is, for instance, arming citizens with critical information on greenhouse gases and climate vulnerability. Ecuador and Mexico are enhancing citizen participation in implementing the Escazú Environmental Agreement. So, in a nutshell, amidst this grim confluence of crises, OGP reformers are advancing innovative reforms that show a more hopeful way forward. Our collective imperative is to scale these up to meet the scale of the challenge. And so this is our call to action for government reformers, civil society, citizens, all stakeholders. At a time when citizen trust in government has plummeted, let us join forces and instead build a citizen-centered democracy by scaling up participatory policymaking, citizens shaping public services, making all contracts, budgets, company ownership open to citizens. At a time when democracy is under attack, let us join forces in making democracy resilient by safeguarding civil liberties and media freedoms, combating disinformation, and convening citizen assemblies to build cohesion when populist leaders are trying to tear us apart. At a time when societies are struggling with the pandemic, let us join forces in making COVID-19 stimulus, safety nets, vaccines open for citizen monitoring. At a time when societies are struggling and confronting egregious worsening inequality, let us empower marginalized groups at the bottom and rein in the abusers of power at the top. At a time when climate change is ravaging communities, let us join forces to tackle climate change by arming citizens with critical information on climate risks and enabling them to shape bold climate actions. To advance this vital but hugely ambitious agenda, we must mobilize a much stronger collective effort through broader coalitions, stronger leadership, and bottom-up citizen pressure. So first, at the country level, we need to broaden the coalition to advance reforms in areas where OGP needs to make greater progress. We must build awareness and enthusiasm for open government reforms across a more broader constellation of ministries, political parties, civil society, such as those advocating for gender, climate, civil liberties. At the global level, we really need to convene a refreshed, strengthened coalition for democracy as an existential imperative to push back against the rise of authoritarian leaders who are spreading the authoritarian playbook across national boundaries. We saw a vignette of such a coalition last year at our Virtual Leaders Summit with heads of states such as German Chancellor Merkel, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, French President Macron, leaders from civil society, World Bank, IMF, and thousands online. But if we are to credibly forge a countervailing force against authoritarianism, we must absolutely multiply this top-down and bottom-up, including at our upcoming global summit to be hosted by South Korean President Moon. And we need to forge stronger partnerships, positioning OGP with its unique country action plan as the implementation arm of vital global initiatives such as the SDGs or the upcoming Biden Summit for Democracy. These coalitions are essential, but by themselves, they will not make change happen. That requires leadership. At the global level, a steering committee of 11 governments and 11 civil society leaders formally leads the partnership. As traditional champions of democracy retreated, such as the US, other countries such as Canada, France, Germany, and South Korea stepped up on our steering committee. But in our present challenging global context, the demands on leadership are vastly greater. Unfortunately, in recent years, there has been a visible paucity of high-level political leadership championing democracy at the global stage. You see, at a time when authoritarian leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orbán proudly proclaim the end of liberal democracy, we need more heads of states, ministers, and mayors to speak out in democracy's defense and show through the power of example how a renewed citizen-centric democracy can deliver better results. At the country level, we need bolder collective leadership across government and civil society to raise ambition, forge broader coalitions, and push against formidable odds. I was privileged to see such leadership in my own staff when the Taliban advanced on Kabul. And against all odds, my staff staged an evacuation of 153 courageous Afghan reformers and activists whose lives were in great peril. Today, democracy is in peril, and we need bolder collective leadership from across the partnership to collectively raise our game to renew democracy against these threats. And for this reason, we have launched an Open Government Leadership Collaborative to build an ever-growing coalition of committed leaders to advance the movement. Complementing leadership, bottom-up citizen pressure can be a huge accelerator. We have seen the power of citizens in the Black Lives Matter movement and in EndSARS protests in Nigeria. A key driver has been the strength and authenticity of youth. You know, over the last 18 months, despite the lockdowns, there has been a huge upsurge of citizen protests globally, visceral demonstrations of citizens' loss of trust in governance. We must absolutely leverage this to demand change, open government to citizens. It is vital that citizens, especially youth, all of us engage, demand open budgets, open contracts, become the eyes and ears of public services, even if the issues you care most about, whether gender or climate, do not focus on open government. Open government approaches that empower citizens with voice and information will be a key part of your solution. And for all of this, the role of civil society is absolutely vital in amplifying the voice and interests of citizens, in pressing for broader social causes, in advocating for open government reforms. And in OGP, they have government reformers on the other side of the table who they can press and partner with to co-create and advance ambitious reforms. So in sum, these three drivers of change can together galvanize a movement, top-down and bottom-up. And this is our vision for the next decade. Transform OGP from a mechanism to a movement, from a global platform to a global movement to renew democracy for and with citizens, to deliver better outcomes for citizens in Kaduna, Ukraine, Costa Rica, and beyond. Now you may say, this seems impossible. But let me, in closing, share with you an example from nature that makes the impossible possible. This is a phenomenon of starlings. See, starlings are these small birds that are vulnerable to prey from the falcon, the predator, which is much bigger and can swoop down and swallow them up. But at dusk, hundreds and thousands of starlings make a formation in the sky called murmurations. These murmurations have a function. It is to drive the falcon away. And lo and behold, you see the awesome power of the collective. You see, individual citizens are like starlings. They vote, but beyond the ballot box, they feel helpless and hopeless in the face of the grand falcons of corruption, exclusion, authoritarianism, climate change. But we have seen in Wangamoon Square, citizen protests bring down the very president. We have seen in Ukraine, young reformers join forces to take on those powerful oligarchs and open contracts for citizens. We have seen in Costa Rica, reformers and activists reach out to serve the most vulnerable. As traditional champions of democracy retreated, the grand falcon of authoritarianism gained strength. With 78 countries, growing number of local governments, thousands of civil society organizations, OGP provides a global platform to forge ever more powerful murmurations, to renew democracy for and with citizens, to forge a countervailing force against authoritarianism, to serve as a bulwark, a beacon, a bastion for lonely reformers and activists under siege, to empower ordinary people to shape and oversee their government, to ensure it serves them rather than itself, to deliver that precious, precious promise, a government for the people, of the people, and by the people.